I'm going to continue with this narrative that we established last week when we were kind of playing with the way that people in general have seen the stars throughout most of human history. This scientific perspective is very, very new. And I'm going to make the case for you. I'm going to continue to make the case for you that it's come at quite a cost, actually. And it's just my opinion, but I'm gonna at least lay some things on the table for you that are kind of interesting. And then we will make it into the birth of stars and the birth of planets today. That's what we're going to be spending this week on for the most part. Again, we're working towards a cohesive story for the lives and deaths of these luminous objects in the sky. So, let's see here. I've gotten through this whole list. So, by the way, if you did miss a class and you missed a class, make sure to send me a short little response after you watch the video on YouTube so I can get you marked down. All right, let's see who is here today. So you mentioned the cave drawings, right, from 30,000 years ago. So this is long before we have any written records. Well, written in the sense of language, but that is pretty shocking, right? That people were, what's really funny about that cave story is that archaeologists discovered these cave paintings. I remember when I was a kid, people were talking about these cave paintings. Oh, they're beautiful. They were celebrating these wild animals. They're actually pretty realistic looking drawings for 30,000-year-old people. There's much worse drawings from the Middle Ages, let's put it that way. But a single archaeologist came along, an astronomer came along and was like, hey, I think that these random dots here aren't just random dots. I think that they're actually mapping the sky. And he went back and he used a software kind of similar to the one that we use for the workshop portion. And because you can run the time back in that workshop software. I don't know if you guys have had any time to play with that. It's pretty cool. Anyways, he ran it back and he realized that the position of the Orion, and I believe it was the Pleiades as well, were accurate to the time from 30,000 years ago when this thing was dated, which is just pretty mind-bending, actually, that this was so important to the people that they wanted to actually make an accurate representation of it. So, and the reason I bring that up is just I really want to impress upon you guys that despite how smart we all seem today with our iPhones and everything, people have been really smart for a long time, just differently, right? Different priorities, different way of going about things. It's hard to even imagine 1,000 years ago, let alone 30,000 years ago. I don't think very many people have a very clear picture, have any precise picture of what life was like then. But clearly people had the time to chart the skies. It mattered to them a lot. And so the natural question is, why did it matter to them? And we're going to keep exploring that. Obviously, they weren't trying to come up with these astrophysical representations of the stars. They were thinking about it a little bit differently. But it was still really important to them. So, yeah, that's pretty crazy. 30,000-year-old star charts. Okay, Peter, you got something to add to that? Yeah, that is kind of mind-bending. So he mentions that the Sumerian language is an isolate. There's only a few of those that we know of. They don't seem to easily trace back in the roots. So just to catch you guys up, there's this idea that our language family, so all of the basic European languages, all stem from this. They use this to sort of retrace the spread of peoples and the development of civilization. And those languages from India, mainland India, from Europe, from the Mediterranean, they all sort of trace back to this area which is called the steppe, which is sort of, I guess, a bit north of Iran. There's a plain up there. And the weird thing is that the Sumerians kind of appear out of nowhere. They have this language that doesn't seem to have any roots in any other language. It's very, very strange. They're a really, really interesting people. And if you go back before the Sumerians, there's just this gap of 3,000 years. Let's say from about 8 to 5,000 BC, where there's just nothing. There's no records of anything happening. But at about 9,000 BC, we have seriously developed cities a bit further in Turkey There's a site that's been getting a lot of attention called Göbekli Tepe. And there's Karahan Tepe. They're finding all these little sites with these megalithic statues, developed mythology, gods, all of this stuff. And there's some resemblance of that when you get down into Sumeria, but it's a huge mystery what happened in the 3,000 years after that. There's this really interesting cycle that we see over and over again in the world, it seems like, where we have these well springs of development, progress, knowledge, mathematics, and then it just gone. Right? This seems to happen over and over again, which is, it's worth paying attention to, right? Because I don't think we should think that we're immune to that happening again. All of our knowledge is stored on these ones and zeros, right? It's really funny. I sometimes think we should start carving some of our theories into stone. So I'm like, gosh, all it takes is one really nasty CME, like a coronal mass ejection, and we might lose a lot of this information. So that's fascinating. And I don't know. I look forward to seeing that story develop of where these Sumerian people came from. I think there's some clues in the Indus Valley, but there's some serious political problems with unifying Western archaeology with Eastern archaeology. There's obvious language barriers, but the Indian archaeologists have a really, let's say, antithetical, if not confrontational attitude towards the Western archaeologists. India was essentially colonized by Britain, and the British showed up and started doing all the preliminary archaeology in India, right? And they set up the paradigm for the Indus Valley civilization. And they were like, like these people came from essentially the steppe. They were the same people. They were basically European ancestors that set up the Indus Valley civilization. Well, that was established, during the imperial conquest of India. And as soon as the British were driven out of India, more or less by Gandhi, which is an incredible story, by the way. Oh, they were also just completely spread thin and overextended, as empires tend to get. But what happened was that the Indian archaeologists started looking at this data again, and they were like, wait a second, I think actually the Europeans came from us instead. Okay, so there's this bifurcation of narratives that happens. And this is something I really want to impress upon you in this course in general, is that oftentimes science is presented as this monolithic narrative, right? This is how things happen. It's how your textbook does it for the most part too, which is very frustrating because once you start to actually study the nitty-gritties of these different theories and so forth, you realize there's actually a lot of different ideas that are under great tension at the core of things. And that's how it should be, right? That's kind of the thing that's, if anything has led to our success as a civilization, it's that we've had this incredible spirit of free inquiry and dialogue and open intellectual conflict, which is really healthy. And it's a little bit scary to see some of that getting sidelined. There's a lot more censorship today, particularly in science, than there was when I was a kid. It's very strange. Disturbs me a lot. So anyways, there's a huge conflict between the Indian archaeologists, even the Chinese archaeologists. It's hard to get access. There's not a good open line of communication between those folks and people in the West, in the European tradition. And so I don't know what's going on. It seems like the Sumerians were certainly interacting with the Indus Valley civilization, but the evidence is, in some sense, under lock and key. It's a very difficult thing for people to study right now. So I look forward to hopefully that becoming more of an open conversation and seeing what happened. But that's a real mystery, really interesting, because and the reason it matters is because we trace all of this stuff, all of these laws of planetary motion from Kepler all the way back. The basic geometry, right? That trigonometry that I showed you a couple classes ago, the basic square laws for finding the distance and triangulating distance, these can all be traced back to the Sumerians as far as we're concerned in the West. So they're really foundation, it's kind of hard to not see the Sumerians as, in some sense, the forefathers, foremothers, however you want to see it, the ancestors of our scientific process. So it's really important, and we don't really know who they are, which is really fascinating, right? Cool. Thanks, Peter. All right. Let's see. Anybody else have something to add to this? Cool. I mean, it's fair. That's all right. Because we didn't totally get to finish. As you guys realize, we missed a class very early on. So I'm kind of like blending two different topics together. I didn't get to finish that. I didn't totally get to finish my thesis last week. And I'm going to try to wrap it up here in just a second. So it's all right. We didn't really form any conclusions. Did anybody think about the Sumerian system of sixes at all? Anybody come up with any hypotheses for why in the world people would decide to? Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely an even number, which makes sense for sure. Somebody posted on one of the I put these lectures on YouTube. Somebody who's not in the class posted that if you take your thumb, you can count the digits on your fingers like this: 1, 2, 3, and if you do all of it, you get 12 on one hand, and you get 12 on the other hand. And so, of course, this is divisible by 6. Maybe that is what's going on. What's really funny to me is that we at some points there was this more, let's say, Greek Latinized tradition of using 10, right? Because of your fingers, I assume. But today we use both, right? It's very, very strange. So that Sumerian tradition persists to the present moment, and it's not, necessarily the easiest way to divide up a circle, but it is the one that we use, and it's the one we use for even our clocks. It's certainly the one we use for dividing up the sky in astronomy, so not insignificant. It's so funny how we have these systems in place. There's so many things that we just operate on autopilot with, and we just take them for granted, and we have no idea where they came from. It's very, very interesting to me. What's that? Oh, dozen, too. Yeah, dozen's an interesting, right? Like a baker's dozen, right? Yeah, that's really interesting. So these things persist, whether we realize it or not. And they trace back to a civilization we know very little about its inception, too, which is very, very strange. All right, so last time I kind of stopped because we ran out of time, and I was trying to make it... I'm trying to... in trying to understand how the ancients thought about the stars, we really terminate on this conflation of what we would call today religion and science, right? And it's really funny because the whole project of science, in some sense, has really subsumed mythological, religious thought. So, religion's never been less popular in the West than it is today, which is really quite interesting. So, Nietzsche predicted this many years before it happened. He said, people are just not going to stomach these literalist interpretations of mythological stories because we have science now. We have the ability to give rational mechanisms for how things happen. And it turns out he is sort of right about that. And it's not clear to me, there's certainly a number of reasons why people are, let's say, justified in being suspicious of religions, right? But it's also not clear that people can live without some overarching mythological framework for their existence, too. And so there's a really interesting tension that's occurring in the world right now, particularly here at the edge of Western civilization, where we seem to have, in some sense, at least institutionally, moved away from religion as a guiding principle. And we've actually replaced it, I would argue, with science, right? Science is what we use to make policy decisions. It's how we sort of orient ourselves towards the right thing to do, which is a little bit bizarre because science was never imagined to be anything that guided ethical decision-making. And it seems like the reason that people came up with myth and with religion, and I'm going to dissect the difference between those two in a second, is because humans needed a way to codify their ethical conduct, essentially, right? And I started at the end of class last time to make the case for you that codes of ethical conduct are in some sense self-evident, right? Like, there's a limited number of ways that people can behave in a room together and accomplish anything approximating a functional society together, right? You can't be sitting in this room right now and concerned that the person sitting next to you is going to, jab you with scissors or something, right? And that's because well, it's completely dysfunctional. And so people have codified that. And I think before they codified it in these things we call laws today, they codified it in something approximating mythology and later religion. And religion, the word religion literally has its roots in the same place as legality, right? Religios, like it means to bind. It's like a law almost. Now that I think appeared a little bit later. But what was before that was these stories that people were telling. And the stories they told are something like, what happens if you do stick the person next to you with scissors in the middle of class, right? Well, it turns out that in almost every single culture, the same thing happens when you do that, right? People don't want to be around you anymore, right? And that's a really oversimplified, silly example. But there are behaviors that have natural consequences, and those are the stories that people seem to have been memorializing in the stars. And we're going to go through an example at the beginning of class here. I told you I was going to talk about Andromeda, that galaxy, a very beautiful spiral galaxy, and how that myth has persisted through time. And we're going to encounter another one when we come back to the Orion Nebula, because the Orion Nebula, it's first of all one of the most visible star system, or let's say star clusters that we have, and it's also the one that your textbook uses as a sort of archetypical example of star formation, because that's where we see new stars forming. So there's this idea that religion is a little bit antiquated today, and that the more appropriate way to attack our problems is through science, which is really interesting. And so there's a number, I picked on Karl Marx last time, but I could have easily picked on famous scientists like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, big podcaster, who essentially say things. They've made quotes to the effect of, religion being the virus of the mind. Of course, Marx thought of it as the opiate of the people, right? Just dumbing people down. Sam Harris has this quote that religion's akin to a mental illness, which allows otherwise normal human beings to reap the fruits of madness and consider them holy, right? So there's this really strong rationalist pushback to religion in our culture today. And it's weird because those condemnations are in some sense at odds with the empirical literature concerning religion, right? So there was this Pew Research study, this huge global study in 2019, where they looked at outcomes for people who were involved in religious groups versus those who weren't. And they found that it was statistically significant that people in active religious groups were more likely to describe themselves as very happy, quote, to join other civil organizations like charities, clubs. They were more likely to vote in elections. And they were also less likely to have crippling addictions, to smoke, to drink, things like this. Okay? So there was another meta-analysis that looked at 850 different research papers and concluded, this is quote, "The majority of well-conducted studies found that higher levels of religious involvement are positively associated with indicators of psychological well-being, such as life satisfaction, happiness, positive affect, and higher morale, with less depression, suicidal thoughts, and behavioral issues, including drug and alcohol abuse, etc." So it's kind of, while there is a rational case to be made that religions have, in the modern world, caused, no paucity of problems, right? Racism, sexism, genital mutilation, crusades, jihads. There's a lot of bad stuff associated with religions. And yet, people who embrace religions in the modern world seem to be doing better, which is really interesting. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I wonder if what's happened is that the people who are rebelling against these religions are really rebelling against the institutional superstructures that guarded those mythologies, right? And so there's a story that I'm going to be working towards with Andromeda that concerns really this age-old story that we have in the civilized world, all the way back to the Sumerians, which goes something like, when you have this overly controlling state, right? And of course, the state for most of human history was no different than the church. When you have this overly tightened down control on the narrative, you get into something that's very tyrannical and oppressive, and that it has to be periodically blown apart in order to release people to actually reorient themselves towards the values that they truly embrace as human beings. And so that will make more sense in a second, but I wonder if something that's going on is that people aren't more rebelling against the institutional tyranny of the church than they are against the actual ethical framework which is embedded in them. And so that's the case I'm going to keep trying to make to you. Now, what does this concept of myth mean, and how does it differ from religion? Does anybody have their own sense of the difference between these two words? Yeah, Dusty.
Myth being a belief and religion being a format.
A format? Yeah.
Written rules.
Rules, yeah. I think that's accurate. So he says myth is a structure of beliefs, right? I would say housing some sort of values, right? Like how to orient yourself in the world. And religion is actually the encoding of that into something like a law. And so in that sense, it makes sense that laws could become tyrannical at some point. I mean, it's very clear, even in my own lifetime, that there have been several laws which have come and gone, which have been at some point imposed and then later deemed unjust, right? And they disappear. So laws change with the power structures that exist, right? The authority structures. However, the underlying value structure that's encoded in myth seems to be a much more ancient thing. So, yeah, exactly. The myths are often defined, in a less pejorative sense than often religion is used in the modern day. It's more a story that's important for a group of people that's useful to them, whether it's objectively true or not. Whereas something interesting happens in religion that people start to get really defensive about whether it's true or not, and they become obsessed with it and kind of defending and walling off the ramparts of the ideology, right? It becomes a defensible thing. I don't think that people who are obsessed with myths are really in any sense arguing that there is literal truth to them. They're more these analogous stories that in some sense are more true than the truth because they encompass so many different individual experiences. So the myth, seems to be a much older concept. It seems to be a much less institutionalized concept. It seems to be more akin to stories that are told because they're useful and they persist because they're useful, whereas religions are often enforced by the state structure. Which is weird for us because we think, oh gosh, like today it's not a problem, right? Like we have separation of church and state. Nobody's enforcing religion on people these days. But I'm going to make the case for you that in some sense we are, in so much as science is very much a new church for our civilization, and the narratives are very much tightly constricted. Okay, so let's take a look at this one example. This is Andromeda up here. This is the constellation Andromeda, which is centered around this galaxy, which is up in the top right. So what's up with Andromeda? What's this story come from? Well, the Andromeda is actually from this Greek myth, but the story, you'll see, it's actually quite a bit older. We can trace it back to the Sumerians. There's a very similar story that's told in Sumeria. And, just to crack this open, there's this story, and the story is about this royal family, the king and queen of Ethiopia. And of course, Ethiopia has a deep, rich history. It's written about a bit in the Egyptian histories as well. Again, there's some cultural barriers with the archaeology there, but it seems like there was a great kingdom in Ethiopia at one point in time. It was very wealthy, and in Ethiopia, Somalia, the Egyptians called it the land of Punt, and they claim to have gotten a lot of their spices and incense from there. It's very wealthy. Anyways, there's this king and queen, King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia is also memorialized in a constellation. And the story goes that Cassiopeia was bragging so much about her daughter Andromeda's beauty, the princess, that the gods conspired to essentially send a sea monster to destroy their city or their country. And the only way that they were going to call this sea monster off was if they gave up and sacrificed their beautiful daughter to the monster. So they chain Andromeda to the rocks out by the sea and leave it for this monster. Now there's this other guy who just happens to be his name is Perseus, and he's just come back from this conquest where he's slain this monster named Medusa. And he comes across, he's just kind of wandering along the coast, comes across this princess chained to the rocks. And he's like, hey, what's your name? And she won't tell him, and he won't go away until she tells him her name. So he gets her name, figures out who her parents are, goes and visits the parents, and he's like, hey, if you let me marry your daughter, I will destroy this monster that's plaguing your town and everything, right? That's kind of ruining your lives. So they're like, okay, yeah, you can marry our daughter. Just kill the monster. So he does. Kills the monster. Some more drama ensues, and eventually he ends up with the princess. So to make sense of what the heck this story is, before we get there, it must be an important story because modern scientific astronomers have kept the name of Andromeda for this particular galaxy. And you might think this happens over and over again. We still name all of our planets, all of our stars. They're all named after these mythological characters, so it must be important to us somehow. Even if it's subconsciously important to us, it's somehow important. So you might think, that seems like a kind of like little bit of a simplistic, superstitious story. What's it mean? Who cares, right? Well, to understand that, I think we have to look a bit further. So this overarching theme of this hero of a dragon showing up at some city, breathing fire, really stinky, awful, ruining everybody's lives. And then some hero is sent out to slay the dragon, at which point usually the hero comes back and becomes, the benevolent ruler of the city for some period of time. And then the whole thing starts over. You see this over and over again. I think the most famous example here in the West is probably St. George and the Dragon, right? But, you see this fire-breathing dragon in Disney movies, right? It still persists, this idea. And you might think, that's really weird that people have. And the Chinese have these dragons, the Mesoamericans, the Mayans have these dragons. And you might think, why in the heck do we have this dragon thing? And, you don't have to look too far to see that the dragon, especially, I think the Chinese representations have really, really captured this well. But if you look at these pictures of the dragon, this one's not bad. But the Chinese ones really embrace the fact that the dragon actually, in some sense, has all of the features of every predator that you can imagine, right? It has the tiger's claws often. Sometimes it has cat-like features. It has this scaly snake serpent thing, right? So like crocodiles, big snakes that are dangerous. It has sometimes the eagle wings, right? So, birds of prey are particularly dangerous actually for small children especially. And I imagine there's an ancestral memory of people's babies getting plucked off by giant eagles and so forth. So essentially the dragon represents everything bad that might come down and destroy you, right? And all these different civilizations have come up with this over and over again. And so something really threatening and bad is appearing. And it seems like in all these stories also this goes on for a while. Like the dragon's there, it's kind of ruining everybody's lives. Everybody's kind of like, yeah, we got this dragon, it sucks, but what are you gonna do about it? It's a dragon, right? It breathes fire out of its face, what are we gonna do about it, right? And so it takes somebody coming along who's kind of extraordinary, right? Almost, I don't want to say godlike, but has this like unending courage and this, usually a special weapon of some sort, and comes along and slays the dragon, and then they're like, okay, this person, lead us forward, So there's a couple of interesting little lessons buried in there, I think, that are not little lessons, but kind of big ones. By the way, this same story plays out in Sumeria with this. There's a very similar monster that's slain called Tiamat by the god Marduk. And what's really interesting in Sumeria, by the way, is that Marduk, this god that slays the monster, the dragon in Sumeria, Marduk is so central to the Sumerian state that every time they have a new king, they name the king Marduk. And the job of the king is to be the best version of Marduk imaginable. And Marduk's a really interesting guy. He's got eyeballs all around his head, right? He can see in every direction. And I think that's significant too, because I think what they're pointing at is something like the person who's got the best view on the situation is probably the most apt leader for the situation, the person who can actually gain the most perspective on how things should be going, right? But they took it so seriously that if somebody wasn't being a good Marduk as a ruler, they would get rid of him, right? And they would put a new one in, right? It was so important to them. So they were living out this myth, almost literally. And you might say, well, did they have actual dragons coming and breathing fire on their city? And I would say to you, well, don't we all sometimes, right? And don't we all sometimes ignore them? Like how many children's stories go something like, Sally started to notice this dragon underneath her bed, right? And she was a little worried about it, but she didn't want to tell her mom and dad about it because she didn't want to bother them. She didn't want them to think she was crazy. And the dragon gets bigger and bigger, and mom and dad keep putting couches over top of it and rugs, and they're trying to sort of hide the dragon so they don't have to deal with it, right? And then eventually the kid is acting the part of the hero here, essentially stands up and goes and in one way or another makes peace with the dragon. It's sort of like, hey, we can't have you living here, you're destroying our house, right? Well, look, this seems to happen in our lives continually. The most obvious example for me, I'm married, right? It's the easiest kind of example for me to think about. But you might experience this with your siblings or with your buddies in college. It's like, how often does it happen if you're not paying attention that some little thing gets in between you and someone else, whatever it is? Maybe it could be something super tiny, like they drank your soda out of the fridge and put it back empty. And you don't say anything, right? Because you don't want to make a big deal out of it. You're just kind of like, dude, why? And what happens is that, maybe something else little happens too, like they don't put the seat of the toilet down or something, or whatever it is, right? These little things start to build up, and they build up. And at some point, they're absolutely ruining your house, right? You have these little resentments that build up, and you're no longer even being friendly towards one another. And you don't know why, because you haven't talked about it, you haven't dealt with it at all. And so it takes a sort of courageous, well, sometimes it just explodes, and you end up yelling at each other and at opposite ends of the house. And, that kind of a conflict, getting chained to the rocks, let's say, leads to maybe dealing with the problem head on. But there's probably a better way of going about that, and the longer that you've been in relationships, the more you'll realize that it's probably better if when somebody, drinks your soda and puts it back empty, that you just have a talk with them right away. And be like, hey, you know what? I love you, but when you do this thing, it drives me nuts. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that, right? And it's not a big deal, and you don't end up with these dragons living under your bed, essentially, is what it comes down to. Now, this can happen on a bigger scale, right? It can happen in a country like ours, too. You can have dragons that are living under everybody's beds all at once, and they're things that are annoying that we don't deal with. It can happen inside of sciences, which is where I'm going to be taking this train back to in a minute, right? you can have things, and I think I brought one of these dragons up in the first part of this course with regard to the material basis of the sun itself. These things, excuse me, there's these things that are obvious, they happen, and people don't want to deal with them, because dealing with them is kind of painful, and there's open conflict, and you have to you're thrown into chaos, you're thrown into the underworld a little bit. You don't know which way's up, because you know that things are broken, but you don't know which way to go. And that's really painful. So we tend to avoid them. And so what does it take to move through that? Well, it takes some sort of extraordinary courage, and it takes some sort of extraordinary weapon too. And I think that weapon symbolizes something like an insight, right? Something like a revelation about how to actually move forward through this, you know? Maybe it's, hey, I know you like this soda. I'm going to actually just buy 2 of them next time I go to the store, right? It could be anything like that. This is the courage. This is the weapon, the secret magical weapon that allows you to slay the dragon and move on. And so I think it's just, you know, we like these stories because whether we consciously relate to them, nobody's thinking about the fact that they have dragons in their house. But we do at the same time. It's really happening. That same story is happening on a smaller scale with all of our individual little points. And guess what? It's been happening forever and ever since humans were a thing, since we could ever articulate our thoughts into language, which we use to convey information like this between generations, right? And so, you know, you might think, gosh, it's pretty primitive and superstitious to, you know, name your leader after a god with like, you know, 50 eyes on his head that's known for slaying this sea monster. But at the same time, it's kind of a cool idea too, right? I mean, we elect these people today that, what do they do? Well, they're really good at climbing these ladders. They're really good at networking. They're really good at recruiting corporate money, right? But do they have any allegiance to any, you know, superstructure bigger than themselves at all? Not really. And so maybe it's not such a primitive idea at the end of the day as well. Maybe there's something to that, you know, something to orienting your leadership towards something bigger than themselves, right? Okay. You know, there's also this other interesting point that we're going to come back to too, which is at the beginning of that story with Andromeda, the mom, the queen, Cassiopeia, she, you know, how's this whole mess start? Well, she's bragging about the beauty of her daughter, right? To especially in some versions of the story, bragging to various gods about it, right? Or to the lesser gods, you know, the servants of the gods, and the gods catch wind of it. And you might think, what the heck does that mean? Like, why does this lead to this whole mess in the first place? And I think there's encoded in that story something really interesting, which concerns the notion of pride and where that can take you as well. You know, everybody, each one of us, we sort of, I think it's fair to say we all sort of exist with this fantasy of who we are, and we, you know, and what I mean by that is we all think of ourselves as the best version of ourselves, right? Like when I think about, you know, who I am, I think this is why conflicts can be so painful with people you love too, because, you know, you do something that upsets someone that you love, you know, family member, whatever, romantic partner, and they say, you know, you're being a jerk, or whatever they're saying, right? And you think to yourself, wait a second, I know I'm not a jerk, like I'm a good person. I pride myself on being a good person. I think I work on being a good person all the time. How can this person think that I'm a bad person all of a sudden? And the reality is that despite all of your best intentions, as a human being, you're constantly falling short of being your best version of yourself, right? I mean, I could do this lecture better than I'm doing it right now, for instance, right? I'm doing my best that I can, but I'm sure I could do it better, and next year I'll probably do it better. But everything we do is kind of like that. And so, in some sense, what this concept of that's encoded in this myth is when people fall in love with that fantasy of who they are, and they start to take this pride over that fantasy, where they start to think, where I maybe start to think that, I'm great because I was able to accomplish X, Y, or Z, or I'm great because, nature gave me these beautiful physical characteristics or whatever it is. It's almost like taking responsibility for something that you don't necessarily have anything to do with, right? So I think they're trying to encode some aspect of humility, because one of the things that leads to really bad conflicts amongst groups of people or individuals is this sense of infallibility of either side, right? How does a war break out, right? I mean, there's a number of ways, but a very persistent one is you just have people that are unwilling to negotiate, essentially. They're unwilling to consider that, well, maybe I could, I could see this a little differently, right? And so, you'll find this too in your interpersonal conflicts with people, right? It's like, I don't really have fights with my wife anymore, but we used to when we first got married. We used to fight a lot, and nothing terrible or anything. Well, but sometimes kind of terrible. And we'd usually get to this point where I'm like, she's completely 100% wrong. She's got nothing, and we go off into, and she's saying the same thing about me. Whatever it is, it's probably something super stupid. And we go off into the opposite corners of the house. And then I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm by myself. I'm like, this is miserable. I don't really want to be fighting with this person. And then I start to think, well, I'm 99% right. There's maybe 1% that she's right about, right? And then I'm able to at least go back and be like, well, okay, I can see what you're saying about this one little thing. And she's like, well, I can see what you're saying about this one little thing. And then all of a sudden, everything's fine again, basically. Cut to the chase. So in some sense, that's a battle against pride in and of itself, right? I have to see myself as not actually having the perfect perspective at any given point in time. And why is that so difficult? It's difficult because we are all living this fantasy of who we are, ultimately. I know that we all want to be the best version of ourselves, but we are not the best version of ourselves. And I think that the beginning of that story is kind of encoding how these giant conflicts happen. And they can happen at the personal level. They can happen at the group level in a family. They can happen at the civilization level. And I think that's why they're so important, right? These myths don't just capture these tiny little examples, right? They capture everything all at once. In some sense, I really think that in some sense mythology is more real than reality, because it's so archetypical that it encompasses all the little aspects of reality into one giant mega narrative. And so as we move forward, this whole course is going to be building towards this concept of cosmology. And cosmology, for all of human history until about 50 years ago, was not a material science. It wasn't based on atoms or anything like that. It was based on what humans' place is with respect to all of the other stuff in the universe, right? And despite the fact that we have handed cosmology over to science at this point, I don't think we're capable of removing this grand archetypical narrative from it that we really, really need to see played out. And it's something we need to discuss and we need to see reflected in the world around us. And so I'm going to make the case for you as this class progresses that the cosmology that we embrace, even using our scientific methods, is still subject to an extreme selection bias for narratives that are congruent with our lived experience as human beings, right? Which are very mythological in their nature. Okay. So this whole process, there's this guy, Joseph Campbell. You guys may have come across him in some of your other classes. He's no longer with us, but he encoded this idea of the myth, and I gave you just one example with Cassiopeia, but the funny thing is, all the myths follow this same basic pattern, right? And they usually center on the central character, who is this, it's often referred to as the hero's journey, right? And there's nothing gendered about this, really. It could play out actually, if you go back and look at the root in a lot of these in a lot of these myths in language, the hero is a genderless character, actually. It's sort of meant to personify anybody's experience in the world as they look out onto some crisis that needs to be attacked. And so there's these steps that appear in every single one of these myths, and Campbell did a great job of laying these out. The hero at the beginning, and these, by the way, every single Disney movie has these steps in it. Most, children's books play these all out. Honestly, the Marvel comic books, most of Hollywood, as far as action-adventure movies, they all play out the same story, right? You first are introduced to the main character, the main character is, kind of got this unsettled feeling like he or she needs to get on with things. There's something out there that's calling them, right? And then they're like, it's really nice here playing my Xbox. I don't really want to do anything. And then, that dragon is really stinking, though, and they're really stirring things up. Things are not right at home. Whatever. There's some conflict that starts to brew. And so they get up out off the couch, and they head out. And then they usually encounter somebody who's had a lot of experience, right? Maybe it was the hero from a previous cycle, and they learn something from it, right? And then they go through all these trials, right? And they go through this whole ordeal that shapes them and forges them and equips them with that magical weapon, right? They get that knowledge that allows them to actually address the problem that they were called out to face in the first place. And, the whole thing essentially results in them slaying this dragon and returning home, where they take the place of the sort of wise leader position, whatever you want to call it. So you might, just to look at this from a different angle, this kind of a neuropsychological way to look at this too, where the golden age of the kingdom is sort of the left brain process, right? So this is what your right eye sees. That's why most of us consider ourselves right-handed and so forth. It's actually your eyeballs and your body actually cross over inside of your brain. So the left part of your brain controls the right part of your body. And this is usually the very ordered side of things, right? And so the left brain being this like golden age, you have this experience where everything's kind of going how it should go, right? The left brain really likes things to be predictable, orderly, logical, in line. And then all of a sudden, it's not. Things aren't in order. Things don't make sense. And the left brain really doesn't like that. And the left brain actually has to call on the right brain, which is sort of the creative, almost like the mystical force of the brain, right? The one that can just see connections and intuit things and so forth, right? So the left brain actually has to invoke the right brain to come up with a creative solution to actually move through the problem. And then the left brain goes back to taking, in some sense, to taking responsibility and like, oh yeah, I solved that problem, right? And so it's very interesting. The more you get into neuropsychology, you realize there's actually two of you living inside of your head. There's a right brain and a left brain, and they have very different personalities almost. They do these studies where they'll do those in animals. But there's injuries that happen to people. They get in car wrecks, all sorts of industrial accidents, and they have examples where people will have their personalities radically altered. Strokes will do this too, and some people, they'll stroke and they'll have part of, they'll say their left brain maybe is damaged, so all of a sudden the right brain becomes dominant. And you can see these very different personalities appear in those cases, right? Where all of a sudden someone's living 100% in their right brain and they have this very wild, intuitive sense all of a sudden. Maybe there's one very famous one, you guys should YouTube this. Her name is Jill. I'll find it for you guys for next time. She was actually a research scientist, I believe, or a medical doctor, one or the other. And she was studying strokes, and then she had a stroke, actually. And so she'd been studying it her whole life. And while she was having the stroke, I think she was in the shower, her left brain got destroyed, essentially, like the control centers of the left brain. And she was having this experience, and she was able to know what was happening while it was happening. She was like, oh my God, I'm having a stroke. And she was like, it's the most amazing feeling I've ever had. Because she was such a left-brained person who was so orderly and so articulate and so detail-oriented her whole life that she'd never experienced the full right brain feeling of just letting go and just feeling connectedness to the universe and feeling intuition about her whole life's journey and the meaning surrounding it and all of these things. And she said it was like the most blissful, amazing few moments of her life. Until it sort of sunk in that, oh my God, I need to figure out how to call an ambulance. And she couldn't do it. She found the phone, and she knew there was something she had to do with the phone, but it's all left brain processing, right? All of that number stuff, it's all in your left brain. So she didn't have that. And anyways, you got to hear this lady tell her story. It's absolutely incredible. She's got a TED Talk on it, and I'll try to dig up her name after class. Anyways, so this, in some sense, the neuropsychologists look at these myths and they think this hero's journey is, in some sense, the process that we undergo on a daily basis, or literally every time we encounter a problem, where the orderly side of our brain has to conspire with the right side of our brain, the creative problem-solving side of it, in order to find a solution and move forward into the more orderly, predictable world. And in some sense, that's the very interesting and mysterious aspect of science too, because, and this is something I'm really trying to fix for next year's course. We're repackaging this course so it can be part of the general education college. And one thing that's always left out of science classes that drives me absolutely nuts is that there's very little right brain activity going on during science classes. It's all about analysis, curve fitting, data collection, evidence gathering, stringing it together, and somehow this idea that, okay, you should maybe come up with a creative solution to what is the cause of the phenomenon is sort of left at the end. Even in scientific literature, the conclusion section is, at this point, it's been slowly chiseled down to being the least meaningful part of a scientific paper. They're almost all literature review followed by results, statistical analysis on the results, a lot of page given to methodology so people can do the same experiment, and then very sort of meek conclusions like, well, it might mean this, but we're not saying that for sure, and that's it. And so one thing I'd like to see more and more of is that we really exercise that right brain side of ourselves in science, that imaginative side that is actually able to draw connections between different pieces of data. Because if you look at the history of science, the people that we really revere are super right brain oriented. The people who are able to look at a whole landscape of literature and just be like, I think something else is going on here that y'all haven't thought of. And so we don't really celebrate that as much in the science curriculum as I'd like to do. And so I'm trying to reimagine the final project a bit more for next year so that can be a more essential aspect of it. All right, so I think I've beat this horse to death at this point. I think it will, if you really, really embrace what I'm saying here, I don't think you'll be able to look at a Disney movie the same again. And maybe you'll watch, you're not watching a lot of Disney movies right now, but if you have kids, you will. And when you're watching them, it's really fascinating to as an adult, watch these movies and realize how much this reflects what's happened in your life last week, right? It's really, really profound when you see it. It's kind of like, wow, we're talking about things that we can't even really talk about because they're so meta important. They're just so all-encompassing of what it means to be a human being. All right, and so, this takes us back to the stars, because what we're doing now, what we're going to be doing the rest of the week is trying to put together, really up until we get to cosmology, we're trying to put together a story of how the stars came into being, how the planets came into being, in particular this week, and then we're going to talk about how they age and how they die. Now, that's not a story that we can just watch happen, right? So, and this is maybe not totally clear from the way that it's talked about, even by experts in the field, right? They'll tell you, this is how a star, these are baby stars, these are old stars. Well, we don't really know that in the way that I know that I'm standing on the ground right now, right? We can't directly see a star. Even the shortest lived stars live for millions of years. Nobody's been around for millions of years to watch a star live and die. All we have is essentially a bunch of still frames from a movie completely out of order, and our job is to kind of assemble them into a story. And that story changes from time to time. Sometimes someone comes along and is like, hey, I think this part over here actually belongs over here, right? So, in some sense, the stories that we tell are going to be informed by our own lived experience on Earth here, too. That seems to be an impossible thing for people to let go of, right? Now, whether that's a valid way of interpreting nature is up for grabs. I encounter, I would say half the scientists that I talk to think that that's a perfectly reasonable approach, that the universe should, behave much like a human being, right? And some people say, why in the world would the universe behave like a human being? We're just one little part of the universe, right? There's no real reason to a priori assume that there's even a life and death of this whole thing, or whatever it is, right? So that's a metaphysical stance that people bifurcate on from the beginning. But the fact remains that it doesn't seem like we can let go of these biases that we have. All right, so what makes telling the birth of stars so difficult? Well, obviously we can't see it happening, so that's really rough. The other part is that where we think it's happening is inside of these giant clouds, which I spent some time last week discussing these interstellar mediums, these nebula. Well, when was the last time that you saw anything interesting happening inside of a cloud, right? In other words, it's very difficult to see what's happening inside of clouds, right? So that kind of makes things, that makes the initial moment of star formation perhaps one of the most impenetrable pieces of this whole puzzle. We can't actually see the moment when stars are forming, right? They're buried in these giant clouds, and it's almost by necessity because, just to preview this story, the idea, which was essentially set up by some philosophers back in the 1700s, is that these clouds, through one mechanism or another, collapse, and they nucleate stars, right? And that's evolved a bit over the years, and we'll get into the details of how that story's evolved. But needless to say, the first moment is happening deep inside of a necessarily increasingly dense cloud, right? Because the idea is that it gets denser and denser and denser, which means you can see less and less of what the heck's happening in there. And the star happens at some point. So this is a really, really tricky story to tell. What we do have, like I said, is snapshots, and we've done our best as astronomers to order them into something that makes sense. But I would be shocked if that story is the same 100 years from now as it is today, especially since this project of really having nice telescopes in space that can see star systems in various stages of what we think are formation, not long, maybe 20 years. So we have a lot to learn, and these stories are going to change. Now, in some sense, I think that's the real meta-mythological story of this course, too, is the way that stories change and science changes over time. And it's something I'm really terrified of because there's a tendency, particularly with religious institutions, we can see historically where the religion and the state were inseparable, and today the science and the state are somewhat inseparable. There's a tendency for them to concretize and become very tyrannical, right? And this is usually when the dragon appears and so forth. And anyways, somebody has to slay the dragon and come back and bring their wisdom back to the people about how to not be so, and it becomes a less tyrannical and more free society. Happens over and over again. A good example of that, your textbook actually brings this up for whatever reason. Giordano Bruno, right? So Giordano Bruno, really interestingly, looked out at the sky. This was back in the 1500s, before Galileo. Looked out at the sky and thought, you know what? I think all those stars are just other suns, and I think they probably have planets, and I think the planets probably have people. And the state, which was the church at the time, the church and state were the same, didn't like that one bit. And Bruno was also, on the personality scale, he was probably one of the more disagreeable people that you'll ever meet. So, but by the way, it seems like all people sort of exist on a range of disagreeability, right? It's one of the big 5 personality traits. And anyways, Bruno was raising hell about a lot of issues. He didn't like some of the theology that had been introduced. Obviously, most of the Catholic religion was taped on top of the original cult of Christianity that appeared right after, really in the last days of the Roman Empire. At some point, the Christianity became the state religion of Rome, which was really, really strange. Took about 300 years, maybe 250 years. And the state kept adding on these different layers of rules, right? This is where the religious side of that belief structure started to appear. That's a whole other discussion, which is absolutely mind-bending because the actual original mythology that was written down by the people who were telling the story of this character, Jesus, the character actually rails against this idea of tyrannical priest structures and religion and stuff. And it's kind of ironic because these teachings then get fed into this huge institutional superstructure that becomes the tyrannical thing that the actual mythological character, Jesus, was raging against in the first place. Anyways, all this is to say that Bruno, by the 1500s, was not buying a lot of the institutional guardrails, right? He didn't like all of these things that had been introduced after the Gospels, and he was quite loud about it. And they burned him at the stake in front of 300,000 people, so people were way into it, right? They wanted that tyrannical structure to keep order so badly. I'll read you a quote from Bruno. He wrote, "There are countless suns and countless earths all rotating around their suns in exactly the same way as the planets of our system. We see only the suns because they're the largest bodies and luminous, but the planets remain invisible to us because they're smaller and non-luminous. The unnumbered worlds in the universe are similar in form and rank and subject to the same forces and same laws." And in some sense, there's a case to be made that that's what got this guy tortured to death and killed, right? Now, we have to be really careful of this kind of thing, and it's interesting the textbook doesn't really mention this, but it's very, very disorderly to have multiple narratives running parallel in science today, right? Much is the same way that the church didn't want to have multiple theological interpretations of the Bible running in parallel at once, which is probably more why they burned Bruno than that many worlds thing that he's often famous for dying for. He was really attacking the different let's say, rules concerning the interpretation of the mythology, the Christian mythology, right? He was like, he didn't like the Trinity, he didn't like a number of things, right? There was all these things that were pasted on top of the mythology that he thought were tyrannical, for lack of a better word, right? And that didn't work out for him. And it's very interesting in the climate today. I didn't bring a good example for you today. The climate, the intellectual climate today. It's still very, very dangerous to get in the way of popular ideas, and there's a lot of self-censorship. The conclusions, like I said, in papers have been shrunk down to almost nothing at this point. There's a strong tendency for these very rigid institutions to become ever more and more rigid because it's reliable, right? It emboldens them to their authority, right? They don't like to be challenged. And so this persists to this day. All right. Okay. So what do we have here? This is the beginning of the story, right? We're looking at the Eagle Nebula. This is a picture from the Hubble Space Telescope. And what we see is some huge columns of cool gas. So it's mostly the things we talked about before. Molecular hydrogen, so that's diatomic hydrogen, a bunch of dust. What's really interesting is that, well, first of all, it's freaking enormous. Let's see, this pillar that you're looking at here is about a light year long. And it's quite far away from us, about 7,000 light years away. Now, what's interesting is this dust is so thick that ultraviolet radiation, it's glowing on the outside, but no light is penetrating the inside. And I think this is actually one of the most interesting pieces of this puzzle that doesn't get enough attention. It's really, really cold inside of these things, right? So star birth, we think, happens in a really cold place at first. Now, why would that be? Well, something that happens, right? You go out on a cold day like today, right? And you might be like walking to class, and you notice you can see your breath in the air, right? Well, what's happening? It's actually condensation of the water, right? Which is actually in a gaseous form, but then it nucleates into these tiny little droplets and ice crystals and so forth, right? Because it's really cold. That warm gas is meeting that other cold gas, really, ultimately, but it's getting cooled really fast, and it's condensing. And so the first moment that actually results in appreciable units of matter, atoms, being sort of stuck to one another, The littlest baby seeds of stars seem to be these cool droplets almost from these condensation reactions. That's really, really interesting because the story that has been told historically, and I do think that your textbook is now talking a bit about condensation reactions, which is exciting. Sidebar, this textbook happens to be one of the better textbooks in existence because it updates in real time. So when scientists change their minds about things, the textbook changes. I've actually been reading the textbook when it changed while I was actually reading it, which is really fascinating. Maybe you guys have seen this too. So historically, when we talked about star birth, we talked about this gravitational collapse idea, right? Which is, it's always been troubling to me, and I think it's troubling to a lot of people because gravity is a really, really weak force, right? We've talked about this before. It falls off with a square of distance, just like light. And you can imagine that if you walk away from a light bulb, you don't have to get that far before you can't really see the light bulb anymore, right? So gravity is the same way, and it's really, really weak. It's really, 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 really weak. And also gases, right? They're all bouncing around off each other, right? And that kinetic energy that they have, how is that overcome by gravity? And so the traditional explanation, and I've been in conversation with astrophysicists about this many times, and they'll often say, well, the thing as a whole is so big, and they're right about that. These are enormous. I have it written down on another slide, but they're enormous. There's so much gas. They're many, many times the mass of a sun if you add up all of the atoms. And so they say, well, as a whole, they're sort of attracted to one another. And there might be something to that, but it still troubles you because gases have a lot of kinetic energy, right? And actually the ideal gas is a perfectly elastic, they have perfectly inelastic collisions, which means that all the energy when they bump up against each other is given in reverse. And so if something's moving and it bounces off another gas molecule, they're never going to stick together in a million years because they can't be deformed. Now, it's modeled with the perfect ideal gas, right? These are the ideal gas laws from chemistry and so forth. There's no such thing as an ideal gas. Also, ideal gas laws assume a container for the gases for the most part. And there's no real obvious container for these things, right? And so what's going on? And so this idea of condensation has actually started to make its way into the discussion, which I think is a bit more logical. Because what happens is when things condense, they lose heat, first of all, so they slow down. So those gas atoms stop bouncing off each other quite as hard, right? You also now have atoms that are sort of joined up into this condensed phase, right, where there's now electrostatic, let's say their shells, the electron shells are actually kind of enmeshed with each other. They're kind of bound up together, loosely speaking, right? A droplet of water has these electrostatic interactions. We call them hydrogen bonds, actually, but they're essentially weak electrostatic interactions. So you have little droplets forming, right? Well, now that you have slow-moving little droplets, now you can start to see how gravity might begin to play a role in this movie. So these giant molecular clouds, really cold, like 10 to 20 Kelvin. So 10 to 20 Kelvin. So just to give you an example, it's around 300 Kelvin in this room right now. Absolute 0 Kelvin would be the atoms are standing dead still, like they're not even vibrating, right? So 10 to 20 Kelvin, that's really cold. That's like, we're talking about these atoms like barely moving, right? So, okay, you got gas atoms, they're standing still, there's starting to be some nucleation, some drops forming. There's already dust particles too there, right? Which you can imagine are absorbing different compounds, waters, liquids, stuff like that. Hydrogen, molecular hydrogens. And it just so happens that there starts to become these little nucleating regions, right? Where these droplets build up, right? And now they start to gain some actual appreciable mass. They start to actually collect chunks of this dust, chunks of this matter. Still extremely cold in there, right? Let's see here. Chemistry starts happening, right? And there's a number of different, this can be broken into two phases. This is kind of a terrible drawing. I'm sorry to do this to you. But what I want to show you is that there's really all sorts of warm chemistry that starts to appear, because what happens is, well, there's cold chemistry, which we talked about. What happens is as the material starts to agglomerate, we call it accretion, right? As these droplets start to stick together, the dust starts to get denser due to gravity, you actually get heat that's generated by that compression, just like in your diesel engine or something, right? That compressive heat. When you get that appearance of that heat, right? So the atoms are kind of now having friction with each other, they're jiggling a little bit. Now you get all sorts of new chemistry that's happening. And so this field of astrochemistry is like brand new. I'm talking like last couple of years. This is absolutely brand new. And it's really exciting because for me, the idea of a big ball of gas collapsing on itself was completely nonsensical when I heard it the first time. You guys have probably popped a balloon before. You could probably pop a balloon in outer space and wait for trillion years and you're not going to get a star out of it, right? Or you're not going to get the atoms aren't going to come back together by gravity alone. It kind of defies the first principles of entropy where gases spread out to fill a container, right? So I was really uncomfortable with that idea for almost my entire life. And so it's really cool to see that chemistry is now making its way into the star formation discussion because it makes a lot more sense, actually. Chemistry is how you can build up things that are bigger than just one atom, right? It's how you can start to stick things together in a way that doesn't depend on this super weak gravitational force. So you get gas phase chemistry, you get cold grain ice mantling, right? The different ices stick together in new ways, and that they can actually act as templates to seed new potential molecular compounds. What's important here is that you're getting really complex matter starting to appear, right? And the more complex and compounded matters that you get, the more stuff that can be that happens to want to stay in one place. More stuff that's in one place, now you actually start to see gravity becoming an appreciable force in the picture. So, where does this take us? One of the best studied stellar nurseries that we have is in the constellation Orion. And so what we see here is, well, of course, our picture from last week, right? And we see a picture, just a regular optical picture of Orion, and then we have the infrared picture of Orion. What's interesting with the infrared pictures, you can actually see some of these non-luminous gases and these dust clouds and so forth that are getting in various stages of illumination by the stars that are thought to be forming within them. And it's really interesting to me, too. I think this is probably a good way to put a pin in our discussion for today, is that this Orion specimen, I think that's a good word for it. It's a specimen, right? It's a model system that we use to study star formation. Well, it's interesting that this is the one that we fixate on as astronomers because it's in some sense the easiest one to see. But guess what? It's also the oldest studied star system in the world, too, because it's always been the easiest one to see. Now, we are thinking about it in terms of these processes of chemistry and so forth, or gravitation, right? People weren't always thinking about it. In fact, it seems like the Orion stories, as far as mythologies go, are the oldest stories ever told, right? That story, in addition to that cave, we see stories about this hunter and this bull in like indigenous traditions from Australia going back, tens of thousands of years. It appears all over the place. So the Greeks actually have a story about Orion too, which is quite interesting. And it kind of ties into our story about pride from earlier with Cassiopeia. Because the story of Orion for the Greeks is that Orion's kind of this like super badass hunter who he can kill any kind of creature in the world, right? But what happens to him? Well, the gods, different versions of the story, but by some retellings, Mother Earth goddess Gaia conspires with Apollo, who's the god of light and science and logic and art and reason and all of these things, to put a scorpion in his path. And he doesn't see the scorpion, and it kills him. And that's a really interesting story. And so the gods, later the gods feel sorry for him that they played this trick on him, and they immortalize him by putting him in the sky, right? And that's how we get the Orion constellation in the Greek tradition. That's so interesting, though, right? So the guys somehow, his pride and how amazing he is has blinded him that he misses, in some sense, this tiny little creature that turns out to be absolutely fatal to him, right? So, in some sense, that reflects this archetypical idea, right? You gotta not be completely lost in that fantasy of yourself, and keep yourself grounded and keep your eyes open like little Marduks, right? You gotta pay attention. I also think that it's really, really significant that these super mythological people in our modern civilization, who are they, right? We've talked a little about this before. We have, basketball players. We have musicians. We got actors and actresses, TikTokers, whatever you guys are into these days. What do we call them? Stars. Right? You think that's a coincidence? I don't think so. Right? I think they are the mythological landscape. And you know what? What do people love to see stars do more than anything in the world? Screw up, yeah. Right? They love to see them step on that scorpion, right? Because they love to see that, oh wow, they're actually just human at the end of the day, just like me. They're not, I could be like that maybe, right? Okay, so let's stop here for today, and we'll continue with what's going on materially inside of Orion's belt next time. But yeah, I hope I've given you guys something to think about. I hope you'll think about these silly children's stories in a little bit different light going forward. And have a great week. I'll see you guys Thursday. We'll do coffee in the morning if you want to come. Yeah.